So, good evening, bon tardi, everyone, and so nice of you to join us today for this lectures evening of ICOMOS organized by ICOMOS Netherlands. My name is Remco Vermeulen, and I'm part of the committee that organizes these monthly lecture evenings. And I'll also be moderating this session today. And today we're gonna go to the Dutch Caribbean, or in Dutch we say the Caribbean part of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, which is a very full mouth. Luckily, we can also just say the Dutch Caribbean in English. And that consists of 6 different islands. And today we're gonna, the 4 speakers of today will share with you some of the current developments in the field of heritage that are relevant for these islands. So we have 4 different speakers. Before the break, we have 2 speakers. We start with Michael Newton. He is an architect by training, specialized in conservation and working in the Caribbean with a very long track record, if I may add. Then we have Stephanie van Heijningen. She is a social cultural researcher and a heritage consultant. Then after the break, we'll continue with Gabriela Jimenez, a urban development consultant. And finally, we'll close off with Nanette de Jong. She's an architect by training as well, and currently, and I hope I did this right because I forgot to check with you, Nanette, a senior policy advisor at the Cultural Heritage Agency of the Netherlands. Yes, like I said, we first will have the presentations by Michael and Stephanie. If there are some pressing questions that somebody from the audience wants to ask right away, that's still possible, but otherwise we just go to a short break so people have time to get their coffees or drinks or whatever. And then we'll continue with the presentations or lectures by Gabriela and Nanette, and we'll end up with a Q&A with the audience. If you have questions during any of the lectures, please feel free to add them to the chat. I'll keep an eye on the chat. And when appropriate, when the time is there for the Q&A, I will also be reading up the questions from the chat. All right, then without further ado, Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Remco. Let's see if I can share my presentation. See something?
Yes, it's very good. Thank you.
Just a minute. Yes?
Yep, all good.
Okay. Because I don't see it completely. Okay, I was proposed by Remco to call my presentation General Heritage Developments and the Trends in the 6 Islands of the Dutch Caribbean. So I'm going to run to all the 6 islands and to give an overview of what is going on there as far as I know, by the way. Curaçao is the largest island, so well, most of the time, half of the time we'll go to Curaçao, but most of you, I suppose, know Curaçao, or at least know it from paper. Willemstad, a World Heritage city, and this is an iconic photo of Willemstad, that the UNESCO World Heritage Site, the Handelskade. But Willemstad is much more than this. As a matter of fact, just next week we will be celebrating the 25th anniversary of Willemstad on the World Heritage List. And next week there will be some presentations, and there will be an Open Monuments Day. So a lot to do next week in Willemstad. But a lot of that happened also before Willemstad got on the World Heritage List, but also a lot of it is going on at this moment. In short, 3 points. I will go through the decline of Willemstad, the recovery efforts, and what happened the last decade. And that's the most important one. I don't know if you know Willemstad, but if you don't know, because these are the 4 districts which Willemstad, the historic area, consists of. Poenda, Pietermaaie, Scalo on one side of the Ennepe and Otsubanda on the other side. But what happened from the middle of the 20th century, an enormous decay in the center of Willemstad, because a lot of people left, there was no maintenance of buildings, and large parts of Scalo, Pietermaaie and Otsubanda were in a very, very, very bad shape. Then around 1990, a lot of things happened. There was a momentum. Everybody was working together. The government, the island government, the private sector, the banking business, the Netherlands, all had the same view of something has to be done with Willemstad to get it on its feet again. So there was legislation put in place, a monument ordinance and a protected cityscape. Various organizations were set up to execute the monuments plan, as it was called, the monuments plan, by the way, which was put together in cooperation with the gemeente Rotterdam. A monument bureau, a monument council, a monument fund, Stadsherstel. So a lot of entities were set up just to get this going. And that helped a lot. Almost all the things which were mentioned in the monuments plan were done, were executed. Among others, financial possibilities for restorations. So this is before and after. You can see the difference, I hope. In Pietermaaie also, this was before, very dilapidated, very bad shape buildings, all restored by private enterprise, by the way, also private initiatives. But what happened the last decade after 2010, so in 2010, the Netherlands Antilles stopped existing. The islands got their own responsibilities. And what I want to show you now for Curaçao is what the government did, the NGOs did, and what the private sector did. The government did very little. The sense of urgency which we encountered in the beginning of the 90s was minimized. And so the disappearance of the momentum, which was there in the 1990s. So from the government side, little is done at this moment. For example, the Monument Council, the Monumentenraad, set up a new policy for heritage preservation. It's still not approved and implemented by the government. No enforcement, handhaving, as we call it. Very little enforcement at this moment. So this is, although there's a lot of restorations took place, still we encounter these kinds of buildings, but no enforcement. UNESCO required for a city management and a management plan to coordinate between the stakeholders. The management plan was approved by the Council of Ministers in 2016, but till now it's not implemented. So we have a management plan, but nothing is done with it. What was done by the Minister of Finance in 2017, under pressure, by the way, of the private sector and the private NGOs, to put up a fiscal incentives for the protected monuments on the complete island, but also for the whole historic city center of Willemstad. So that's what we have, and one of the results of that was the Curaçao Heritage Fund. Private initiatives, you can buy shares in this fund, and this fund buys buildings and sometimes restore them, but most of the time they're restored already. But again, they maintain all that those historic buildings, especially in Pietermaaie. If we look at the NGOs at this moment, we have various of them. The largest one and also the oldest one since 1954 is the Stichting Monumentenzorg Curaçao, completely private. The Stichting Monumentenfonds Curaçao, semi-governmental, but who gives the funding for restorations. We have a Stadsherstel, restoring buildings, Fundación Pro Monumento, among others, organizing the Open Monuments Day, DOCOMOMO for the modern architecture, and NAM for the archaeology and anthropology. This is an example of Monumentenzorg. It was finished in 2019 or 2020. there are plans now to make it a center of music, as I may call it. Furthermore, I cannot tell you anything because I understand it's still a secret, but it's a center of music, which will come in this building. And because Ochobanda was always, this is not Ochobanda, by the way, Ochobanda was always very known for its musicians. And a lot of these musicians or families of these musicians or entrepreneurs are looking at using this building in a very musical way. If you look at what happened in the last decades, there are 743 listed monuments in historic Willemstad. That's about half of the buildings are listed. The total in Curaçao, 816. And in the last years, last 30 years of the existence of the Monument Fund, also some 250 buildings were restored, co-financed by Monument Fund. And again, besides that, some 60 buildings by Monumentenzorg and others. If you look at the recent developments of the NGOs and private initiatives, and that's from the last, say, 2-3 years, the most controversial one is this, the wharf, and new buildings on the waterfront in Schalo. You see new constructions, 3 towers. This is it's not finished yet, so this is how it will be. There's a lot of discussion about these buildings in the center of Willemstad, but they are halfway now. The concrete works is done, and the intention is to have it finished in the course of 2023. So really next to the entrance of the harbor. And okay, you can like it or not, but the view itself will be enormous, looking to the entrance of the harbor. Another development is at the waterfront building. Stephanie will talk about it afterwards. But it's this is one of the studies, one of the designs. This is not the design which will be executed. I know there are very different designs already. So, but the intention is to, next to the waterfront where the Plaza Hotel is at this moment, there will be a whole new construction, together with the pension fund, the APC, Algemeen Pensioenfonds of Curaçao, and the Dutch consortium, the Heritage Plaza Consortium, which will jointly make this a new development in this part of Punda. If you go to Ochobanda, this is the area of what we call the Cura Hollanda area. It's also near the entrance of the harbor, which was in the 1990s restored by Stadsherstel and by the late Mr. Jacob Geld Dekker. Just before he died, the whole hotel, which was in these buildings, they went bankrupt. But last year, the whole area was bought by local entrepreneurs, and they are restoring now. And just last weekend, the next restaurant opened in this area. So step by step, it will be used as a restaurant for different restaurants and hotel, residential locations. So it will be a mix of functions in this Cura Hollanda area. Another interesting development is the former hospital, the St. Elisabeth Ziekenhuis, which is empty at this moment, mostly because there's a new hospital built next to it. But the owner, which is the Bisdom of Willemstad, decided that the building should be restored and they cannot be or will not be demolished. So there are a lot of things going on now to get this on its feet as a, well, let's say a city within a city of Ochobanda. Then the last part of Curaçao, the Fredrikstad area, as I call it, it's really hot, this Fredrikstad area, the last 2 years. A lot of buildings which were in very bad shape are being bought by local and international entrepreneurs. And for example, you see it over here, a building which is, well, its roof collapsed. All this area is in a very bad shape, but there's a lot going on. Recently, well, it's almost finished now. Stadsherstel restored this large building, just also in the Fredrikstraat. You see these curas, and cura is an area with a lot of open space around it. These are 2 of them. from the 18th and probably 19th century, in very bad shape, and also bought by entrepreneurs, and the restoration drawings are made as we speak. So in the course of next year, the restoration will start over here. And this is the last one, also a courage chantoms next to it. If we go to Aruba, Aruba is, what I always find interesting is the architecture of Aruba. This, what we call Latin American neo-Baroque, is the city hall at this moment in Aruba. And this kind of architecture, this Latin American Baroque, you will not find on the other islands, almost nothing. On Aruba, you find various interesting examples, all from the beginning of the 20th century. And well, Aruba is most closest also to Venezuela. I don't know if that's part of that you will find these kind of buildings in Aruba and not in the other islands, but it was restored, now the city hall. The problem in Aruba is that you don't have listed buildings from the private sector. And all of government, all the 37 buildings which are listed are government owned. There are propositions since 2015 already to designate some 50 privately owned monuments as protected monuments. The Monument Fund of Aruba, which exists, however, doesn't give financing for private monument owners at this moment. No subsidies, no loans, because well, they didn't get the money from the government yet, and the government has not yet designated them buildings because they say there's no money. So it is a status quo in this kind of thinking, that the private individuals cannot use monument funds. It's a pity because the Monument Fund of Aruba itself is very active. They were established in 1996, and they work without really any funding, any grants, any subsidy from the government, but they look for their own money, and they use, among others, low interest loans from the National Restauratiefonds. And well, their balance last year was some 80 million florin. And what I want to propose is see their annual report on the website. It's a very nice website. I just studied it again. It's very open, very transparent. They publish all their annual reports. And that's something you don't see often. But again, for the Monument Fund of Aruba, it's interesting. They restored some buildings, some special buildings recently in the California Lighthouse, the west side of Aruba, built in 1915 and restored in 2016. This is a tourist attraction. You can go up till the top, walk around it, and have a beautiful view of the surroundings. And another one very interesting building, which you also can visit inside, is a water tower in San Nicolas, also from the 1930s, sorry, in the so-called Art Deco style of Aruba. And also a few years ago, it was restored. Another example of a building restored by Monument Fund of Aruba, and this kind of restorations really help redeveloping the whole area. Yeah, it's like this Nicolas store in San Nicolas. Also, another one, the Uncle Louis store from 1950s. Restored in 2020. And even they got the Peter Vollenhoven Prize last year for the redevelopment of a monument. So interesting building. And the last one, the Veranda House, built in 1936. Also that Baroque architecture of Aruba, the neo-Baroque. This is how it looked quite some years ago. And this is how it looks now. And it is a real, will be a real challenge to restore this one. So the intention is that Monumental Fonds of Aruba will also pick up this one and restore it. If we go to Bonaire quickly, Bonaire really, the architecture, historic architecture is mostly on the seashore and a little inland, but most of them used to be on the seashore. You have a heritage ordinance in Bonaire. There are listed monuments over there, some 22 designated properties, but there are much more. Some 259 monuments were selected, but till now are not listed. And this is an interesting building, and you see how something can deteriorate in a few decades. I use this building because it used to be for my grandfather, but he sold it in the 1940s, so he's not responsible. This is what you see over here. But you see step by step, every decade, it goes, it's in the worst shape, and it's gone now. It's not there anymore. There used to be a monument fund for Bonaire. It was founded in 2016, but no Dutch financial support. So the executive council, dus burgemeesters en wethouders, as you could call it, they also were not willing to co-finance the fund. And the supervisory board resigned in 2018. They said, well, it's no use sitting in the board if we cannot function. So also here is status quo. They made an erfgoedplan for Bonaire in January 2021, but also in this case, the government didn't adopt it. And so it's still a piece of paper and not being executed yet. Maybe this building is restored, I don't know, but it's a picture of 10 years ago. But it's a real example of buildings, which you will find a lot of them in Bonaire, very typical for Bonaire, but also in a very bad shape, and no view of when they will be restored. And then another phenomena in Bonaire is the higher constructions. Historic buildings are being demolished, and higher constructions, the badplaatsarchitectuur, as the NRF called it themselves, you will find that in Bonaire. And that means that, for example, on a location where there used to be a lot of historic buildings, all were demolished, and high constructions, the tourism architecture is built over there. And the character, really, the character of Kralendijk Bonaire is, well, almost gone in this sense. Looking at St. Martin, since 2005, they have 51 protected monuments. There were various initiatives to set up a monument fund, but till now they didn't succeed. So there's no restoration financing, so no grants or loans for the private monument owner. And because of that, also hardly any restoration projects are taking place in the private and government sector on St. Martin, unfortunately. These are the kinds of buildings, kind of older buildings you will find in St. Martin, Philipsburg, wooden structures. And this is in the front street, the main street of Philipsburg, but very few are left. They were demolished, and new buildings, mostly 2 or 3 story buildings, concrete buildings were built. This is still existing, and it's also in quite good shape, the Vineyard Estate, and it's kind of plantation house. And the nicest thing, the most interesting thing is it was bought in the United States prefab, and that's of course in the area of the Caribbean islands was often a lot of the time the case. Prefab houses imported from the United States. Another plantation house in St. Martin, the Mary's Fancy Plantation, bought by the pension fund of St. Martin quite some years ago, some 10 years ago. But this is how it looks now, completely to work on a restoration plan together with Greg Sandwijk. I saw his name over here somewhere. But unfortunately, till now, the pension fund didn't succeed in starting the restoration of this project. Very complicated situation in St. Martin, and they're looking at possibilities now to restore it. But also an example in Front Street, an historic building owned by a well-to-do family, but they don't do anything. They just leave it empty, and the tourists are walking around it. But again, unfortunately, nothing is done. If we go to Sint-Eustatius really, I don't know if you've been there. I always think it's a very interesting island. It has a very rich history and still various ruins and on the lower and upper part of Oranjestad, as they call it. In the mid-1990s, there were various restoration projects done, especially with private residential houses, and it was paid by Dutch Developing Aid. They have a monument ordinance since 2020, but no listed, not officially listed, a lot of potential listed, but not listed. They can make use of the low interest loans of the Nationale Restauratiefonds, but at this moment, there's no monument fund. And the one looking after it's trying to get the funds of the Nationale Restauratiefonds isn't living on Sint-Eustatius anymore either. So for the private sector, it's difficult for the private residential houses. And these are those houses which were restored some 20 years ago with Dutch money, all residential. Next to the Fort Orange, which is well known because of its first salute to the US flag, recognizing the US independence in 1776. So just count, in a few years, they will be celebrating 250 years of this event. And they will try to get at least the vice president of the US to this island in a few years. So who knows? Another project which I'm also involved in is the Hill Compound project, also next to the fort. It's an 18th century building, Dutch bricks, wooden structures, and a building which had a top, which had the second floor, but was probably blown off in a hurricane. This is bought by the pension fund of the BES, the Bonaire, Eustatius, and Saba, the pension fund, and they bought us as an investment and recovery of this area of Oranjestad. This is the way it's going to be. You see at the back, at the top, you see the fort, so it's very near the fort. And again, it will be restored. And another thing which I encountered now is the additional cost due to hurricane resistance requirements. Especially after Hurricane Irma, the very heavy Category 5 hurricane in 2017, with wind speeds from 295 kilometers an hour till 360. A lot of damage was done on these islands. And for example, if you compare it with the Netherlands storm Eunice at the beginning of this year, and the Netherlands talked about it for weeks, the maximum was 145 kilometers an hour. So imagine how huge this Hurricane Irma was. And again, additional special resistance requirements are in place now on these islands. Finalized Saba, very small. They just have, well, this is the largest one, the largest area at the bottom, the Hoofdstad. You have also Windward sites and Hell's Gate, but with a very special architecture, those very Saban cottages, always white paint and with a red roof. But also over here, there is an ordinance. There are even 11 objects on the inventory list, but there's no legal protection, there's no monument fund, so there's no organization to look after these monuments. And even, unfortunately, now more and more concrete constructions are built in Saba. So the fear is that the character of the wooden houses of Saba will be gone. An example of a concrete building. At the end, my statement will state there will be no preservation of heritage in the Dutch Caribbean without any financial incentives, grants, low interest loans, and tax incentives. So at the end, we need these kinds of financial support if we want to safeguard this shared heritage, by the way, in the Dutch Caribbean. Thank you. And by the way, these are the two websites, cubisarmonuments.org, if you want to know anything, and the one of Aruba, as I mentioned already, very interesting one. Thank you.
Right, Michael, thank you very much for this very comprehensive overview of heritage on the 6 islands. Thank you so much for this. And also thank you for ending with that statement, which may not be super uplifting, but unfortunately slightly realistic, and hopefully we're on the right track in getting more and more how do you say that, incentives indeed for heritage conservation on the islands. All right, then I would now like to proceed with our next speaker, Stephanie van Heijningen, and she will tell us all about a project she has done a research for, the water fort in Willemstad, which most of us will probably also know as the site of the Plaza Hotel. All right, Stephanie, the floor is yours. I hope that wasn't that was not a how do you say that? I didn't spoil it.
Oh, thank you, Ramco, for the introduction. Yes, I'm gonna share my screen first. Can everyone see it? Is it okay?
Yes, thank you.
Yes, okay. Yeah, so I'll be talking about, like Ramco said, the water fort, which is situated in Willemstad, Curaçao, and more specifically in the Plaza Hotel complex, which was recently acquired by APC, Algemeen Pensioenfonds, in 2020, with the goal to really, or the plan to develop the site. It is mention worthy that the water fort is a protected monument and that it is, as Michael Newton also said, located in a World Heritage Site, which is Willemstad. And ultimately, my research was written down in, or my research findings were written down in the form of a critical heritage report, which I will get into. Oh, I need to do the full screen, I think. Yes.
This is also good. Thank you.
Yeah, now I can actually do next and it'll, yeah. So basically the goal of the critical heritage report was to gather information to aid in the formation of a restoration philosophy, individual or like independent of factors such as the technical state of the water fort in which it currently occurs, the budget, so the financial resources, and the ultimate purpose of the water fort, so the eindbestemming of for which it will be used in the future. So it really is kind of a idealistic point of departure based on solely the values of the water fort in social, cultural, and historical perspective. The reason why I did it in the form of a critical heritage approach is because heritage management has significantly developed over the past decades. So the way we look at heritage now is different from 50 years ago, for example, and it will be different in another 50 years or 100 years. So it's really looking at it from a critical perspective, which is really kind of becoming not just a societal, but also an academic discourse on heritage management, especially considering factors like post-colonial cities and a different perspective on heritage. So, like I said, it's a very global and interdisciplinary perspective on heritage values. Yeah, so as I explained, there have been quite a lot of developments since Willemstad is a World Heritage Site, one of which is the Convention for Safeguarding Intangible Cultural Heritage, for example, but also the introduction of concepts like the historic urban landscape, social sustainable goals, and sustainable development goals, human rights, and yeah, aspects like that. And really in my approach, I decided to have a very people-oriented approach to looking at not just the water fort, but the whole ensemble around it, because it is part of a World Heritage City. So in this text, it's very broad, but it really explains how it started off as a very technical matter. So heritage management was very about technical solutions, scientific solutions to managing and safeguarding heritage, and now it's also incorporating cultural and social and economic aspects where we just look at a more holistic view of how to manage heritage. So departing from that idea, I decided to focus on one of the criterions based on which Willemstad is a World Heritage City, which is criterion 2, which addresses the colonial ensemble and the multicultural community and the historic port town, which developed over 3 centuries. So to start with the multicultural community, I basically gathered some data that we have over those 3 centuries. It's not a lot, but there's some of them which I have presented in my report, and I just have one example which I'll present in this presentation. But basically, the development started in the 1630s when the West Indian Company arrived with, let's say, higher government officials, military personnel, and there was only a small group of native Indians residing in the city. And that quickly turned into an international free port. So it attracted traders and merchants from all corners of the world because there were no restrictions in which Curacao, let's say, traded with. They were open to all ships and all flag carriers. Then in the 1700s, you really had a development of different layers of society. So you could really see like military personnel, in terms of how it's written in the sources back then, you would say white government officials, white and elite Jewish merchants and workers. Also in the table here in the right lower corner, you can really see how the community was divided in categories such as whites, colored, freed colored, blacks and slaves, free blacks and slaves. This is really because it was written like that. Nowadays, it would not be correct to state it that way, but I stated it as the sources described it. So this also not only gives an impression of the numbers, but also the way people looked at society and categorized society at the time. So then in the 1930s, we had the arrival of the oil industry, which brought a lot of people, a huge immigration influx again from different corners of the region and outside of the region to work at the refinery. And then kind of at the end of my research, I have the 1950s tourism area, which brought not so much residents, but really a different crowd to the city, like different city dwellers, which would also influence, let's say, the cityscape to a large extent. Just to fast forward to now, this is an idea of the population decline in the past 50 years. So in the 1970s, we had almost 8,000 residents in the inner city total, which has gone down to 2,000, and it's probably declined even more if we look at the data now, which is not yet available, but there's definitely a very sharp declining trend when it comes to residents in the inner city, which is worrying to a lot of people because it's really changing the look and feel of the city if it's desolated as it is now. Secondly, I looked at the historic port town, and I really wanted to focus on kind of a historic urban landscape when addressing let's say, cultural expressions of this multicultural community. So really looking at a sort of cultural mapping approach, looking at different ways that the community would express themselves in a more intangible way. So here we have just to get an idea, I think pictures work the best, but you had pretty much everything that a city had. People would sell bread, sell water, transport people from one side of the city to the other through ferries. There were shoemakers, tailorers, beard groomers, like everything you could think of, people cooking on the streets, selling animal skin, selling alternative medicine, pharmacies. Like it was very vibrant. And it just attracted a lot of people because there was money to be made in the city, not just by the elite merchants and the official, let's say, commerce-driven people, but also everyone else around that group. Also, more creative expressions such as photography and music really had a free range to develop in the city because there was no censorship, because Willemstad again was a free port. There were no issues of censorship and publication. So photographers and musicians really had a lot of freedom in publishing their works, and that really created a platform for a lot of creatives to sort of establish and work in Willemstad, which made our music very famous in the region at the time, which is a very interesting side note, but it's really interesting. Notas y Letras, like the middle picture, is a magazine that would, for example, publish a lot of music and a lot of work. Let's see, on the right corner, you have the hat making industry. In the next photo, we can see, for example, the hat making school, the straw hat making school in Pietermaai, which was the largest industry before the arrival of the oil industry. And there were more formal institutions like schools and churches. We had Protestant, Catholic churches, and also the synagogue, for example, which is the largest surviving synagogue in the Americas at the moment. Also, the formation of societies, I think lodges they're called. So yeah, there were different, just life happened in the city and different things happening at the same time. I also found it really important to mention the role of Willemstad in the transatlantic slave trade. So Willemstad was really an arrival and a transit port for slave trade. And here I kind of introduced the concept of what researchers would call, or academics would call, a site of conscience or dissonant heritage, which is really heritage that we would rather not present or talk about, or let alone celebrate or glorify. But I felt it is important in the conversation that is happening now on colonial heritage. So in the upper right corner, we see in the red marked area that there used to be what they would call the negerhuizen van de compagnie, so the Negro houses of the West Indian Company, where approximately 135 permanent slaves behind the fort would reside. So there was also, as you can see in this table, like a permanent amount of slaves also residing in Willemstad outside of this, outside of these houses. But it wasn't just a transit port, just to illustrate that there were also house slaves there, and just various residents of a slavery background in Willemstad. Also part of the idea of dissonant heritage is a recent study by a human geographer, which is Charles Dorrego, who recently found out that there used to be the gallows there. At the situation that I was also researching, which is also a more dark side of heritage, which is not celebrated. And he is convinced that some important historical figures were tortured there. But it's too early to talk about that, but I did want to bring at least this piece of evidence forward. Aside from these sort of semi-physical remains, there's also kind of mental inheritances of a colonial past. So really negative sentiments around colonial heritage and material remains of colonial heritage. Just to get an idea, emancipation movements that came way after still refer back to Tula, one of our largest freedom fighters in terms of abolition of slavery. 30 de Mei, 30th of May, which many people know and still remember as an expression of protests against unequal labor wages based on ethnic and social divides. So like half the city was burned down as part of that protest, and still conversations about statues of West Indian Company leaders, governors, etc. Here I also have a quote that sort of expresses the dichotomy, or like the duality of how people feel about monuments and plantation houses. So literally translated, I admire them because of their style, but I hate them because they are evidence of inhumanity and forced labor and lashings. So it's still very mixed, and this mix is still present in Willemstad. If you look at it, there's still modern expressions of them written on the walls sometimes, etc. To go down to the Waterford, I think one of the most important things to mention about the Waterford is that it was not integrated with all them happenings in Willemstad. So it really was an enclave on its own because it had its own military agenda. So there was very little interaction and interchange between the Waterford and the city around it. So that's very interesting in terms of how we're going to look at the Waterford now, and what we're planning on doing with it. But here we have just an overview of all the different specifications. I'm not going to read them all, but I think one of the most important thing to mention are the bomb-proof vaults in the lower right corner, which mentions the 69 bomb-proof vaults, also known as the arches. And it really is an asset of the Waterford, which is very strongly associated with it. Like the general population really calls the Waterford even the boogjes, so the arches. So these are a very important asset, or like a quality of the Waterford, which is the repetitive vaults, which were actually initially just ventilation holes for the gunpowder to be released. Regarding the vaults, in my research, I was advised, and I also did that approach, to look at which vaults were a bit more significant than others. This is just a paragraph out of one of the books that talks about the original function of the vaults, which I will get into in a bit. In short,
just for your information, you're now at 15.
We're at 15? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm almost done. So in short, it was not a WIC fort. This fort was built by the Kingdom of the Netherlands, because the WIC did not exist anymore in the 1800s. The fort did not see any military action, even though there were military barracks and it did have a military agenda. It was never involved in any military action directly, although it did have military traditions, as most military sites do. For example, when ships would go in and out into the St. Anna Bay, a salute shot would be fired and the flag would be raised. There was one raid by a military figure from Venezuela who did successfully steal many pieces of munition that was stored in the Waterford fort. But again, nobody was hurt or killed. And in the Second World War, the fort was very well equipped with a lot of military equipment. Again, it had a lot of things installed to protect the St. Anna Bay from any potential attacks. But again, it was successful in doing so, seeing that nobody dared to attack Curaçao, I guess, because again, there was no active military action. A great turning point for the Waterford was in 1955, when it was bought by the Hotel Corporation to be turned into a large hotel. Just to get an impression, these are some pictures, some folders, and memories of what the hotel era at the time looked like. It's really to communicate kind of that glorified and very nostalgic and lush character of the 1950s hotel era, which was also of a large influence to Curaçao and to Willemstad, because it really marked Willemstad, or that area, as one of the destinations to be visited at the time. Very strongly associated with other large hotels like the Waldorf Astoria and others in that time in the 1950s. There were also a lot of shops that catered to the needs of tourists and visitors, so quality goods, authentic goods, art galleries, very high-end things, offices like the CTB office and the KLM office, CMB, the bank office, and restaurants later came to the picture too. So as you could see, the Waterford and the arches got a completely different function, compared to the military function that it was initially built for. Also, there are two squares in the vicinity, which is the Plaza Cola de Brot and the Plaza PR Square. The Cola de Brot is fairly neutral. The PR people are very sensitive about. I've talked to groups and organizations that are really about protecting that statue. So these are things that would have like high cultural value, or some things that would have to be very well discussed if we were going to think about doing anything with them or preserving and safeguarding them respectfully. In short, so the restoration, it really was a depart from a very traditional restoration philosophy. So the Venice Charter, which focuses on aesthetic and historic values, and we moved on to more broad values, more modern values, and also a bit more into the intangible sphere, so scientific, social, and spiritual values. So we started by defining these values and then developing sort of a level of significance for these values. And then we basically suggested all of these, and then based on a workshop and interactions with people, we came up with a couple of them which persisted in valuing the Waterford, which I have categorized in these 4 principal values. So evidential, historic, aesthetic, and communal values, which contain all the other values that I've just mentioned. And based on this idea, this is just an idea of how you would visualize the philosophy or the restoration plan. There's high and medium levels of values. Again, I'm not sharing all of it because it's way too much to share, but just an idea, for example, the structure itself would have very high value. And then the areas around it would be also of medium significance because there could be archaeological findings potentially, or because of past memories, such as the squares, the gallows, the Negro houses of the company, potential stuff that you might want to introduce for conversation or discussions on what to do with them. Here, there's on a more meso level, the values of the different casemates individually. Some of them, as I said, are a bit more relevant or significant than others because of their historical use. So this is just an overview of how they would be valued differently. The ones in the corners would have higher values because they have a different or more relevant function. Again, it's accompanied by a sort of philosophy that we came up with. And then lastly, the micro values. So really stuff like the windows, cannons, greenery, whether there's anything in there that we would per se give high value or not. Most of the micro values are low to medium. And greenery, I know that, for example, with the birth of Queen Juliana, there was a tree planted, the Oranjeboom, which they removed. But if it had still been there, for example, that would be greenery with high value. But sadly, it's not there anymore. But anyway, so this is kind of an impression of my research and how we sort of translated that research into different levels of restoring and different significant stages of the values that accompany this very important structure. So thank you for listening. And yeah, if there's any questions, I'd hear them.
Right. Thank you very much, Stephanie, for this very interesting, presenting your very interesting and elaborate research that you did. I would suggest that we now first have a short break. Could you please stop sharing your screen, Stephanie?
I'm trying.
Then we just have a short break first. Keep it a bit short, keep it maybe 5 minutes. And then we continue with the other 2 speakers, and then we'll do the Q&A for all the speakers. I saw there's already some questions in the chat box, which is great. I hope that you're okay with keeping that for the Q&A. All right, then we'll see each other again in 5 minutes.
This meeting is being recorded.
Right. Welcome back all. I hope you managed to get some tea or coffee in the 5 minutes that we had that we just had the break. And I would now like to proceed with the second part of this lectures evening. And the first presenter of this part of the evening is for afternoon for Curaçao, of course, is Gabriela Jimenez, and she's going to tell us about a masterclass that was held a few weeks ago in Willemstad. World Heritage meets Main Street. All right, Gabriela, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Remco, and thank you all. It's my pleasure to be present here today, representing the masterclass World Heritage meets Main Street. This took place last month in Curaçao in the celebration of 30 years of Monumental Fonds. I'd like to take a moment to analyze the picture presented. Besides noticing the low quality and bright colors of this picture, you can also notice the mix of cultures, ages, and diversity among the participants. Therefore, very intergenerational and interdisciplinary masterclass. And if you take a closer look as well, you would see that you could spot the 4 speakers that today are presenting. And I myself, Gabriela Jimenez, would like to take you through a short version of this masterclass today. So who are these participants and who do they actually represent? To have a better overview, I used the onion diagram. And here you could see the stake, the market, and the civil society and how they played a role. Initially, this program was initiated by Monumental Fonds along with the Ministry of Traffic, Transport, and Spatial Planning of Curaçao and the Cultural Heritage Institute in the Netherlands, along with the IHS of Erasmus University. Together, they joined forces and they introduced this masterclass, World Heritage Meets Main Street. It showcased opportunities for a strong commitment between the public and the private, but also between NGOs and other parties involved, such as consultants, architects, and Main Street itself. So many of you might ask, who is Main Street? Well, Main Street is actually an American program. It was established in 1980, and it was a way to address various issues that were faced in older and historic downtowns throughout time. Main Street has been, in the meantime, developing many communities, around 2,000 in America itself. And their strategy for this is bringing back economic vitality while celebrating the historical character and identity of each place. For this, they kind of developed a roadmap for revitalization of historic towns. However, they did mention through their experience that every town and every commercial district is different and therefore have their own distinctive assets and their own sense of place. So the framework that they offer is very community-based and it's pretty flexible in the sense that it can adapt to the local conditions of each area. So you might ask, why is this approach applicable to Curaçao or how is it transferable? Well, mainly this approach is dedicated to small town management, which are areas and communities below 5,000. And Curaçao or Willemstad fits within this category. We have a lack of capacity and a lack of resources to manage the downtown. And therefore it's a guideline to bring different parties, both public and private, and towards how to manage and redevelop the historical port town of Willemstad. They've also had a lot of success throughout the 42 years that they've been present. They've invested more than 95.3 billion on physical improvements, created new businesses, new jobs, and in total, they created a public fund that is feasible in the long term. Another reason why Main Street approach is also applicable to Curaçao is that it's based on trends, ongoing trends, sometimes economic trends. This is displayed in economic vitality. We have the sign, which represents the physical, promotion, the social, and organizational, which is the political sense. These pillars create together the transformation strategy, as Main Street calls it. And it's a transformation strategy due to society's demand changing with new trends from the market. For example, while we have a lot of Dutch influence, there are influences from American markets, such as the introduction of malls on the outskirts, This could be seen in Stambil, where the downtown area starts losing its quality and retail market of commerce, and also the influences of mass tourism, such as the cruise ships. So I would like to take you through the week overview in a short 15-minute presentation, primarily starting with an introduction, which is already given by both Michael and Stephanie, on the importance of our World Heritage Site, the historical and cultural values that we see in it, but I also want to take a moment to see the dependencies and the influences that the downtown has gone throughout time. These present challenges for today. We visited the site, and in the site of Willemstad, there's 4 districts, but this masterclass focused on Punda and Otra Banda. And later on, the masterclass really focused on having an understanding of the 4 principles, which are organization, promotion, design, and economic vitality. And our work was to work in team groups, multidisciplinary, and see how we can implement this framework for the different case studies. I'll keep this short because I think it was mentioned previously, but it is important to understand why Willemstad is so unique and what the opportunities are. As previously mentioned, there are 3 criteria which enlist Willemstad as a World Heritage. This year we're celebrating 25 years under UNESCO. And there should be pride on the tangible and also intangible aspects like language, traditions, and festivals such as Carnival. So I'd like to take a moment to zoom out and see the city through the lens of not only the urban development, but how it developed throughout time with dependencies and social changes, changing demands throughout time. This was a combination of a lot of arguments or discussions we had in the group work of what are the challenges that Curacao is currently suffering, and are they challenges that come from past experiences or present situations. So this is a bit of my thesis research. I combined it with this masterclass because I feel visuals represent more than words. As mentioned, colonialism, especially Dutch colonial times, really influenced our urban fabric of Willemstad, being one of the largest transatlantic ports in the area. This showcases that there is a taboo within the feeling of colonial heritage and slavery, as mentioned by Stephanie. But we also had another dependency, which was more an economic dependency introduced at the beginning of the 20th century. This was the oil refinery Shell. While it might have had a positive impact in infrastructures, it also influenced the heritage urban fabric by creating barriers, but also by creating racial segregation through unequal payments, and that created the revolts on 30th of May in 1969, which largely influenced our urban landscape by burning many buildings. However, very resilient, in 1997, we managed to, together with the Netherlands, have the World Heritage Site in UNESCO. And this was a moment of pride, which influenced the present day of today, where we noticed that tourism has become the new economic dependency for the island. This can have positive effects with new boutique hotels opening up, museums, but it also has a negative impact in mass tourism and who we're targeting at the end. You see a lot of souvenir stores opening in our downtown district. Throughout the groups, these discussions and these points were arised. What are the dualities of these aspects, whether economic versus environment, such as the unsustainable industries of the refinery and cruise arrivals, also the environment versus social. Do we have inclusive urban areas or the exclusive port areas? And then one man's waste is another man's treasure. So seeing the monuments and the value that they have to bring them back to life. I would like to finalize these trade-offs and discussions that we have within the groups with the following quote. Old ideas can sometimes use new buildings, but new ideas must use old buildings. This is by Jane Jacobs, a well-known urban spatial planner. To conclude these challenges that we currently see presently in our urban landscape of Willemstad, I would like to notify the following 3 aspects. Primarily, the decay and vacant buildings do not represent the full potential our island has and the lack of maintenance that we've seen, even though this is currently improving in the last years. There's also a decline of population, mainly brain drain, which means a lot of the people go study abroad in Holland and don't tend to come back on the island. This creates an issue. And then we have lack of coordination and collaboration between the stakeholders involved. So I want to take you to a virtual mini field trip to the case studies we visited throughout the master course. The knowledge we learned from the expert presentation was actually applied to these real-life courses, case studies, sorry. And one of them is situated in Punda, which in our local language, papiamento, means the punt, the point. And the other one is situated at the other side, which is Otra Banda, meaning the other side of St. Annabelle. So as previously seen, most of you might recognize Punda through its iconic pastel-colored Handelskade. However, I would like you guys to see that Punda is larger and it's developed more than the colonial times. There are other buildings that represent different functions, such as Plaza Viejo, Plaza Marché, where goods, arts, and crafts are sold that represent our cultural heritage. Whereas there's still a lot of open public spaces and empty, vacant new buildings that no longer are serving its purpose. And also you see that this has created a space for new buildings that do not fit our urban landscape. Here you have an overview of the vacant buildings in Punda currently. This creates a type of division between the district of Punda itself and unsafe feeling due to the abandonment and lack of connectivity. So now I want to take you to the other side, Otra Banda. This side, while containing a lot of monuments, the face of Otra Banda has received a facelift, or you can say an imitation of the colonial architecture. However, this was actually due to the riots that happened on the 30th of May, where many buildings were burned or destroyed. Till the day of today, some of these buildings have still not been restored, and some of these have been demolished, taking place for new buildings that don't fit in our urban landscape. However, don't be fooled by the front side. The back side of Otra Banda has many hidden alleyways towards monumental buildings, as mentioned before, Sebastian Pol Plain, Molen Plain. So it's actually a connectivity between alleyways and monumental buildings. Here an overview of the case study in Otra Banda. There were a few clusters of vacant buildings in pretty bad state of abandonment. And together with my team, we came with the concept of otro vibe, which means another vibe in papiamento. And we identified some challenges in this urban landscape. It was primarily the lack of connectivity, the vacancy of buildings, the narrow alleys had a stench. The stench was urine. And this happens because these areas are not used to the full potential. So people tend to use it for the inappropriate function. Our team came up with a solution to create clusters, and this allows it to work as a puzzle piece, together each fitting its own way and kind of offering its own unique piece in different target groups. Think about elderly, young professionals, even children. So these puzzle pieces and clusters are actually meant to come to life or to connect with each other through people itself. So they walk through the areas and they have a different experience and a different route and flows. Quickly, an overview of these recommendations: connectivity equals the reactivation of a space, enhancing the identity of the area through authentic, multicultural, and innovation. And I'd like to finalize this otro vibe concept with the following quote. Culture and climates differ all over the world, but people are the same. They'll gather in public if they give them a good place to do it. This is by Jong, which is a Danish urbanist. And then to finalize the takeaways I myself found from this course, was that it's a holistic approach to community transformation and historic redevelopment. For these 4 pillars, it's important to think of tools to use it. One of them is the promotion of an area through placemaking. The other is the organization in the short term and the long term. And then economic vitality. It's important to think of a mixed use program, not only targeting tourism, but thinking about new pillars to our economy. And lastly, the design. We're in a historic port town. It is essential to think of adaptive reuse to meet the new demands of society. So the next steps from this course, or how it could be implemented, is to start a kickstart, then have monthly meetings with the involved parties, create a revolving fund, and then implement it and maintain it. These are the recommended steps, but essentially it's not realistic. Realistically, it's more of a mountain than a linear path. Every step of the way is going to be its own challenge. And once you reach the top, it's only the beginning of another journey, or in other words, another pilot project that should be implemented in our inner city of Willemstad. This following the master plan Main Street approach with the 4 pillars. And yeah, that's pretty much the presentation of the masterclass. Masha danki, as we say in Papiamento, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Gabriela. It was a very nice and comprehensive overview of the masterclass, and thank you for also adding the recommended next steps. And let's see whether these next steps will actually materialize. But thank you for giving this very good overview. All right, and also thank you, by the way, for keeping exactly on time. So that's great.
I'll talk a bit fast.
No, it was perfect.
Great. Okay, perfect.
Thank you so much. All right, well then, last but not least, I would like to give the floor to Nanette de Jong, who will tell us all about our current, very recent mission to the islands, to the Dutch Caribbean, in the context of the culture covenant that was recently signed. Nanette, the floor is yours. Is it working? No, I don't hear you, by the way. Nanette, I don't hear you. Nanette, can you say something? Just to check? No, I don't hear you. Connecting to audio again. Hopefully that helps. Nee, ik hoor je nog steeds niet. I still don't hear you.
You hear me now, Remco?
Yeah, now I hear you.
Okay,
Perfect.
great. So I'll try to share my screen again.
Yeah.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, I can see your screen, but I think now you have to move to the first slide.
Yeah. Sorry. Sorry, everybody, this is not going as planned.
Stress.
Yeah, no, it's stuck now.
Now it's going to the well, one of your slides, not to the first slide again. Can you? Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So I'm. Oh, yeah. So this is the first slide.
Yeah. Now you're there.
Sorry for this interruption. But I will tell you now about my trip in the culture mission to the Caribbean Netherlands. So we go from Dushi Curaçao now to the other islands. I'm working for the Dutch Cultural Heritage Agency. So I work in the Netherlands, but I was very happy to join the culture mission. And on the left side of this slide, you can see a painting by Dolf Henkes from 1947 of Potrobanda, and that is in the state collection of the RCE. And it's one of the few of the islands in the Caribbean region. And I'm going to tell you about, this is my personal report of my trip. And I'm just going to mention some highlights that people showed us. So it's not a full comprehensive overview. And I do not want to pretend anything, to know everything or something about the islands, but at least I've been there, and that was very good. Because we all hear and we know that all the islands are so different from each other, but it's very good to be there and really experience and really understand the situation. So the culture mission was meant to talk to the islands of Ceiba, Statia, and Bonaire about the culture covenant. On the 27th of September, so 1 month ago, the State Secretary Gunay Uslu signed the covenant with the 3 public entities at the same time online. On the picture on the right side, you can see the signing of the covenant. And on the top row, you can see the 3 public entities for the islands of Ceiba, Statia, and Bonaire. And in the Netherlands, we call them the openbare lichamen, so the OL's. And in the lower row on the right side, you can see the State Secretary, Gunay Uslu. And so the government is meant to establish a sustainable cultural infrastructure on the islands, and we do that together. On the left side of the slide, you can see the tweet of Gunay Uslu on Twitter, where she stated this. And so now this culture covenant will be worked out in a cultural agenda per island, so it can differ per island. There is no additional funding for it, but it's all about a better cooperation and better using of the existing possibilities. And there are, for instance, some state funds like the Mondriaan Funds, the Fund for Cultural Participation, the Film Fund, the Literature Fund, the Performing Arts Fund. And so that's, those are in place, and they are also accessible for all the islands. The focus in the covenant is about getting the basis in order and special attention for the cultural heritage sector. So this is where the RCE comes in, because we work in cultural heritage. And it's now up to the islands to come up with a concept cultural agenda. They are the ones in the lead. All islands have mentioned that they want to have an agenda ready before March next year, because those then are the new elections. So on the left-hand side, you can see a picture of us, of my travel companions. We were 5, and we were all there from the Ministry of OCW. And there were people from the International Policy Department, of Arts and Culture, of the Caribbean Netherlands section and of RCE. And on the right-hand side of the slide, you can see the topics that are mentioned in the Culture Covenant. In yellow, I marked the ones that are for RCE, so that's about the cultural heritage. And the other ones are about libraries, digitization, and archives and education. So the cultural heritage sector is mostly about built heritage, public collections, intangible heritage, archaeology, underwater archaeology, heritage and spatial development, and cultural heritage in times of crisis, and the cultural participation and the Treaty of Faro. So traveling in the Caribbean is quite exciting. On the left-hand side, you can see a small plane. If you want to travel to Ceiba and Statia, you have to go through St. Martin, and you can only reach in a small plane. And especially the landing strip on Ceiba is very exciting. It's very short. It has mountains and cliffs on both sides. It's even mentioned in the KLM plane that that's a very dangerous landing strip. But I really loved it. So that was also part of the experience of the whole trip. But it says also something about how distant and far away those islands are. So I'm talking about Ceiba and Statia then. And on the right-hand side, you can see the OLB, so that's the Openbaar Lichaam of Ceiba, where we talked to the people of the government there about that covenant, and we also handed all of them the signed covenant and printed covenant. And I'm talking to you, I'm showing you a lot of slides of people, because it's up to the people to take care of the cultural heritage. We know all about the buildings and all the other sites, but it's about the people. They have to do it. They have to do the work. So then about Ceiba, this picture already was shown, but it's a very small island, only 13 square kilometers, and it has about 1,900 inhabitants. The main language is English, not Dutch, and everything is very well arranged. All the houses have the same architecture, so they have the wooden, these are the traditional wooden houses with the red roofs, and the stone part of the kitchen with the chimney, and the historic houses have all this water cisterns, the water tanks. And they're all painted green and white. There are no listed buildings, like Michael Newton already said, and that was not necessary because everybody knew how they had to treat, how they had to maintain their house. Everybody painted their houses white and green, so there was no use for a law. But that has changed now because a lot of foreign people have moved to the island, so now there's a need to have rules. And also the OLS mentioned that they want to protect the water cisterns because they are so characteristic of the island. And also, for instance, the ladder. I will mention that later. And like all islands, Ceiba is also very rich in intangible heritage. And we heard many times people speak about Ceiba lace, where you can see a small picture on the right-hand side of the slide. So that's also very important there for the Ceiban identity. So about the ladder, that's a very important place on Ceiba. It used to be the only way to enter the island from the sea, and it was 400 steps up to walk to the bottom. That's the capital, the main village. And in former days, everybody had to walk up these stairs to bring the goods up. And of course, the heavy goods were carried by the enslaved people. And only since 1930, the island has a road of now 14 kilometers long. So this is a very important historic place for the island, and it needs protection to remember the history and to tell about the history, because we need to know more about the history. That was made clear by everybody who talked to us on this trip. So after Seba, we went to Statia. So that's the island of Sint Eustachie, but locally it's called Statia. That's about 21 square kilometers, and it almost has 3,000 inhabitants, and also there the main language is English. And it's a totally different island with a very turbulent history. During the 18th century, Saba was in the heart of the trade and also in the heart of the slave trade. So this is an historic picture of Statia of 1781. And you can see still a lot of houses on the lower part of the city, but they have now all been, they have all vanished into the sea. But like also Michael mentioned, and I think also Stephanie, that in 1777 there was cannons. They saluted some ships in the harbor, and they were American ships. They didn't know that, but that was the moment when the Americas were recognized, United States of America. So that's a very important part of that island also, and that will be celebrated in a few years. So that's a very important part also of that history. And we need to know more about that history. And the OLE also took us to two important sites. This is the Golden Rock archaeological site on Statia near the airport. And when a new road to the airport had to be built, there have been excavations of the African burial ground here. But the African descendants community has objected to the excavations. And to tell the story in my words, the excavations were executed following international standards, but according to the community, they do not agree with those standards. Because the standards, they say that you can excavate the human remains there, but they don't want their ancestors to be excavated. They want them there because they are part of their everyday life. So there was a big issue about it, but now all stakeholders are in a committee and they want to work together towards a solution that fits all. And then they also took us to the Godet plantation on Statia. That is, as you can see, near the sea. And this is a very important historic place because there are some traces of settlement of the Amur Indians that were there. And there are also, it's also an African burial ground of enslaved people. And there are also ruins of the Fort Amsterdam that used to be there. And this is the place of the island where everybody came to the island from the sea. And also the enslaved peoples. This is a very important place. But as you can see, the sea is taking the land. And recently the government has protected this area with a stone wall but already those stones are taken away by the sea. So it's a very it's a very endangered site, and well, the OLE is really, this is their main priority, to protect this site and to safeguard it, and it should also be designated as a listed archaeological site. Yeah, so we visited the site with SECAR. You can see Nick from SECAR here, and also the OLE. So you can see them on this picture. I would just like to mention that on Statia there are no historic buildings listed as monuments. There is a list of 45 buildings, but the listing process has not been fully completed. There is a protected cityscape though of Oranjestad. But that's also something that can be mentioned in the agenda, and that would mean that the basis could be in order if that could be arranged. So next thing, we went to Bonaire, a much bigger island with over 22,000 inhabitants. And on the picture you can see on the left-hand side the OLB, so the government of Bonaire. And well, here we experience how difficult the cultural issues can be when the local political situation changes. The covenant was signed by Mrs. Den Heijer, but she left, and now the culture dossier is with Mr. Kroon, who has a different opinion about culture. So that makes every decision taken in the culture dossier a political decision. And on the right-hand side, you can see a picture of the small slave houses on salt pans of Bonaire, and an obelisk. This one is white, but there are 4 of them, and they're painted in the colors of the Dutch flag, so blue, white, red, and orange, to guide the ships towards the different salt pans. And these houses and sites are protected as monuments. There are about 25 monuments listed on Bonaire, 40 others, the dossiers are ready for listing, but they're waiting for the political okay. And there's a big list of more than 600 buildings that are worthy of listing, but they are waiting the political decision, and that's really, that's difficult. I would also like to mention here the Dutch new policy from our cabinet, which is comply or explain when it comes to the Dutch Caribbean. It means that all laws and regulations that are made in the Netherlands also apply for the Caribbean Netherlands, or you have to explain why not and propose an alternative. And that is why the Ministry of Internal Affairs discovered that they have to make sure that there are spatial development plans for these 3 islands. And they are busy working on those plans now, and it would be good if those plans could incorporate the listings of the buildings and the archaeological sites. So it would help if the basis would be in order and that they could use those information for their plans. And then it would really mean a good protection. Yeah, I've almost finished. So just to conclude, I also, next to the culture mission, I went to Aruba, and this is the same picture as Michael already showed about the Veneranda building, which is owned by the Monument Fund of Aruba. And I also visited the Monumentenbureau in Aruba. And I was astonished. Well, it was a pleasant surprise to discover that the Monumentenfonds Aruba when they restored the Neve Louis store that Michael showed, is that they paid attention to the energy consumption and energy saving. So they have the air conditioning on 23 degrees instead of the usual 18 degrees. And they gather the water spill, and use it for flushing of the toilets. So I thought that was a very promising thing on Aruba. And to conclude, this is a picture of St. Martin, where we also talked to the culture department passing through on our trip. So we didn't stay there, but we just had a small talk. And an important part on the culture agenda will also be the cultural heritage and crisis. We also talked to on Curaçao to the representative in Willemstad, who is responsible for making the disaster management plans for all the 6 islands. And he also wants to include a chapter on culture in those disaster management plans, because after the hurricane, also in St. Martin in 2017, it was clear how important culture is in times of crisis. And the historic buildings, they are very resilient. You can see on the left-hand side a drawing of the building, where you can see that in the corners those wooden houses are reinforced, and they were still there after the hurricane. It was the new buildings who were blown away and who caused a lot of damage to the old buildings. And on the right-hand side, again, a picture of the Vineyard House in Philipsburg. And they have a double set of shutters for storms and hurricanes. So there's a lot of knowledge and traditions about dealing with hurricanes and crisis. And the culture department of St. Martin will start next year a campaign which is called iReach, where they want to talk to all the inhabitants and to learn about the old traditions, to learn it for future crisis. And it would be good if those would be also in the culture agenda, and that we that it would be a good example to incorporate it into the disaster management plans. So that's the tour of all the islands. Thank you for your attention, and if there are any questions, we can ask them. We can respond to it later. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Nanette, for this comprehensive overview of your cultural mission. And let's hope that this new covenant that was signed, that this will mean there is new opportunities for heritage conservation on at least the 3 best islands. I would now like to go to the questions, and I saw there's already been a few questions that were posed in the chat. Let me start with the first one, if I can find it. Even kijken hoor. Yeah, so the first question, I think this was for Stephanie from Juliette Budding from Monumentenzorg, Curaçao. Is there any updated information on the population numbers in the 4 city districts in Willemstad since 2011? I think you mentioned there wasn't, but can you?
Hi.
Yeah.
Yeah, if there is, it's at least not accessible publicly or online yet. So it's no, I can't get any recent data on that. I don't know if there have been any recent research to bring it in perspective, but as soon as there is, I'm also on it like a hawk, but it's not online yet. On CBS, at least it's not.
Then I have a question, and I think that's a question for all the speakers from Jean-Paul Korten. Could I ask the speakers to define what they see as key challenges in heritage management on the 6 islands? Or just on Curaçao, but let's keep it with the islands. Or at least, well, I mean, the 3 speakers are from Curaçao, so maybe that's also easier to keep it close. So, Michael.
Yes, well, Curaçao, I finished my presentation with the financial part, which is less important for Curaçao. Curaçao is, the Monument Fund has funding. There's always, of course, a discussion how much funding you need and how much funding is available, but that's a second thing. On Curaçao, it's more the government part, which I mentioned, which is lacking interest at this moment. But for the other islands, is the lack of interest from the government side. Nanette already mentioned on Bonaire, where the new gedeputeerde Mr. Kroon is in charge now. Unfortunately, I have to say, I don't know if somebody in Bonaire is listening at this moment, but he's not really interested in culture nor heritage. He's more interested in asphalt. So on the side of the governments, it's the lack of political willingness, but also the lack of the organization at the government at that side. That's according to my point of view.
Does any of the other speakers want to add to this? Gabriela, Stefanie, or maybe Nanette?
And I agree with Michael. Indeed, the capacity from government public side. I do think the private side has taken initiative. So I think there might be ways to incentivize. That doesn't have to be financially, but also with building capacity to share the information of how to do this more efficiently.
All right, thank you. Stefanie, would you like to add too?
No, I basically also agree with Michael, and I really think, well, it's also one thing that came forward during the workshop. It's really the lack of cooperation with the government. Like, for example, the larger projects, like the Waterford, for instance, is owned by the government. So you would really have to have their cooperation and their to be on the same line and to actually have them involved as much devoted to the project as the other parts of the team would be. So I think that's basically a really big challenge. And also because the government changes every 4 years or even more frequently on the island, so the unstable political situation here. So I really would say that that's a big issue. And there's also the awareness among the local population. So the appreciation of heritage and it not being educated early on. And I'm not talking about higher education, I'm really talking about primary education, where heritage values should be in the upbringing of individuals. Let's just put it that way, because that's where it starts. By the time you teach it at the university, for example, I feel like the students don't care as much as they should. So yeah, that's really one other obstacle to really heritage management here. But.
I just wanted to say that that what I thought was remarkable was that I was impressed by all the young people we met, and that was so hopeful. Everybody like you in the also in the Main Street masterclass. I had the feeling that the young people were very willing to cooperate and to have a bigger societal goal to everything, and that it's mostly the old people in politics who are putting up the thresholds. So I would say the main challenge is the old people in the political parties, and that all the young people they should take over, and then there's hope.
All right. Well, this is an assignment for both Stephanie and Gabriela. Michael, beware.
I have to go.
Okay. Right away, he's leaving.
Of course, there are some very wise old people that are always needed. But I was mentioning people in the political.
No,
Yes.
but I'm agreeing with you,
Area.
Nanette. I was also surprised by the young people at the workshop with their input, and not everybody is has the right possibility of having the right point of view, but there's a lot of positive input.
Yes.
But on the other islands, still now, I don't see it. I don't know if you have seen it, Nanette, but on the other islands, it's still
Yeah, on Seba and Bonaire, yeah.
Yeah.
You've really seen it, yeah.
Yeah.
And those are the people who are also involved in the agenda. So I hope it will work out. And I think the good thing about the culture covenant and the culture agendas is that the islands are in the lead now. So that's, yeah, hopefully that will change.
If they bring their input.
Yeah. Indeed. All right. Well,
Yep.
thank you for this. Then I have two more questions. I think specific. Oh no, not. I think it's literally here for Stephanie from Xiaobai Chen. The first question is there any criteria to define the values mentioned in the last several pages of your PowerPoint on Waterford's Willemstad?
I didn't address any specific criteria or use any guidelines on criteria. What I did was that I combined, so basically the Venice Charter and the values that they mention in the charter, and then there's also the Buddha Charter, which also mentions certain values. And I looked up literature of what they would say one of the founding fathers of heritage values, which is Riegel. I don't know if you've heard of him. I can write it down in the chat. He wrote The Modern Cult of Monuments, and in his paper he addresses some basic, let's say, values that you can assign to monuments. And that paper started sort of more academic discussion on heritage. This, you have a lot of academic writers who respond to this sort of fundamental paper on heritage values. For example, Bonekamper. I can also write that, Dol Bonekamper, I write it in the chat, and he added different values such as nostalgic values and conflict values. So it really is not so much a criteria rather than an academic discussion of values within the heritage debate. And in the bubbles that I presented in my research, it's the values that I figured or felt would resemble or at least reflect the research that I did. And then during the workshop that we did with a lot of heritage professionals on the island, certain were definitely given a higher value. So those were the ones that I would maintain in the simplified version of conservation principles. So it was a whole process before I got to there, but there aren't, there's not a specific criteria that you can use to define them.
And then there was the second question, is the Plaza Hotel a very high or tall building? If so, has there been made a heritage impact assessment by UNESCO or local authorities for the construction of this building before approval?
I'm not sure. I think Michael would be better at answering.
Well, I don't think that the final design is there yet. There was, I think, twice a workshop on the island with various proposals for what the new architecture can be, because the intention is at this moment that the old building, which was built in the 1950s, will be demolished. Also the tower, and that something new will be constructed next to the Waterford. And I know there are architects now working on the latest design, but I have not seen any design yet which is approved or which is proposed to UNESCO for its approval. And I don't think, as far as I know, there's no final design yet.
No, and I'll add to that they are busy with the heritage impact assessment generally, just but I don't know to what extent it's based on what might come, because Michael just said that there's not a final design yet, but there is a process on a local level where we would want to do a heritage impact assessment ultimately, and they're busy with that now.
Answering this question. I hope, Siobai Chen, that your question was answered. If there is no other questions anymore, then I am afraid we're already at the end of our evening or afternoon. Yeah, we ran a little bit over time, but I hope that all present were at least interested, and that's, yeah, we delivered what you expected of this evening. I would like to thank the 4 speakers of today, Michael, Stephanie, Gabriela, and Nanette, for your contributions. This was super interesting, and let's hope that there is a brighter future for heritage conservation in the Dutch Caribbean ahead of us, and that there is some kind of momentum that we can make use of together. All right, thank you all very much, and see you next time. Actually, the next lectures evening is on the 14th of December. Let me double check the details. 14 December, and it's about community-oriented approaches to heritage management in Zimbabwe and South Africa. So we're going to a different part of the world next month. Hope to see you then, and for now, good afternoon, bon tardi, and good evening. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.